Thank you for being with us, Mitch, on this incredibly wonderful day, but a sad surrounding, of course. You've written a landmark report about radicalization in America that leads to terrorism. What do you mean by radicalization?
We meant something very specific when we were talking about radicalization. We were interested in charting the process by which an individual's thoughts turn to violent acts, specifically in the context of terrorism.
So what is that process?
That process is one where an individual starts out probably secular, not that different than maybe you or I grew up, and over the course of a time period that's compressing in the years since 9/11, an individual decides to change their identity, adopt a different belief system, and ultimately can justify violence against the West, against their fellow countrymen.
And specifically, what are those factors that motivate it?
There are a variety of different factors. Some of them are a feeling of alienation, a feeling of not fitting in, looking to participate in a cause, a movement.
That's like two-thirds of the youth in this country.
Right. Well, in the beginning part, it's very difficult to distinguish who's going to turn to violence and who's just going to be a motivated activism. But what this person does, they turn to high-risk, high-cost activism. They maybe travel overseas to get some military experience in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Syria, in Iraq. They adopt a belief system that says that violence is okay under certain circumstances, and there's a low threshold for committing violence.
But that was all happening even before 9/11, correct? That's what led to 9/11.
Well, when we looked at the hijackers in Hamburg, Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shahi, the pilots, they actually radicalized to violence, not in Egypt, not in the UAE, not in Lebanon, but in an apartment in Hamburg. And when they arrived in Afghanistan, they were already looking to fight in Chechnya, fight somewhere, and they were turned by Al-Qaeda, pointed toward the US. So Marwan, when we're talking about radicalization, it's all about change. These individuals undergo a change. So they may start out as secular, but it's that process of change. They become politically active. They want to do something for a cause. It's the West versus Islam, and they need to fight on behalf of Islam. Or
they have grievances.
They clearly have grievances, political grievances, and oftentimes the religion can provide the justification.
So as long as there's a war on terror going on the ground, through drones, in the greater Middle East, in the Islamic world, you can always expect a blowback, or you can always expect certain radicalization among the Muslim communities in the West. That's what you're saying.
I think that's true, because if you look at what's happened over the last 4 years, probably in 2009, the homegrown threat in the West peaked. And then with the killing of bin Laden, the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, and the fact that the US was pulling out of Iraq and Afghanistan, the threat dropped. And now as ISIS has come onto the scene and there's more violence in the Middle East and Westerners traveling there, now the threat is way back up again. There's the threat from the outside in, the threat from Syria and Iraq, the threat from Yemen, the threat from Afghanistan and Pakistan, from ISIS, from Al-Qaeda splinter groups. But then there's a threat that germinates in East London, in New York City, in West Amsterdam.
So you think that Muslim communities are suspects?
I think that
in principle.
I think that they're vulnerable. If you're talking about an ideology, Al-Qaeda's ideology, it's based maybe superficially on some interpretation of Islam, so it's going to appeal to Muslim communities.
Is that why your report paved the way for surveying an entire Muslim community in Brooklyn, for example?
When IRA terrorism was a focus in the UK and in the US, who did that message resonate with? It didn't resonate with Italian communities, it didn't resonate with German communities, because it was an Irish cause. So it's going to resonate with that diaspora community that's attuned to those issues.
So let's talk about the repercussions, blowback. Once an entire community is suspect in principle because of an ongoing war throughout the world against terrorism, against fundamentalism, whatever it is, in the end of the day, is that really containing the threat, or is that really alienating even a greater community, leading to even more grievance and perhaps to more radicalism?
So Marwan, in my previous position as Director of Intelligence Analysis at NYPD, my responsibility was to prevent a terrorist attack in New York. And the one thing that we never wanted to do was after the fact say, we missed somebody. There was someone who we should have and could have been looking at, and had we paid more attention to them, had we prioritized them, we would have stopped an attack and there wouldn't be dead bodies in New York City. And that happened in London. The UK was looking at some of the individuals who ended up being the 7/7 bombers years beforehand, and they fell off their radar screen. From an intelligence perspective, you never want to miss that person. You want as much intelligence as possible, and there's a conflict.
Which means more surveillance.
Well, so there's a conflict because ultimately, yes, the most surveillance gives you the most intelligence.
No, I don't want to interrupt you. What is the conflict then?
The conflict is how much intelligence can you collect versus where are the lines with civil liberties?
But Mitch, the line has been pushed and pushed, starting with the Patriot Act onwards, and it continues to be blurred. And I'm not saying this is whether it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that as long as there's a war out there, a global war, you guys are going to have to fight your own local campaign, war, combat to terrorism. I mean, in the end of the day, as long as the United States is involved in the war outside, you guys are going to have to do what you're going to have to do. And that involves sometimes trampling over civil liberties.
I agree with you up until the last part, the trampling over civil liberties. When you're talking about terrorism, figuring out who conducted the attack after it happened, well, that's too late. Trying to intercept the 3 or 4 guys as they're heading to the subway with knapsacks on, that's not too late, but you have to be pretty lucky to be able to identify those individuals.
So how do you do that then?
So we can't stop them there. Stopping the individuals as they're plotting the attack, as they're building the devices, that's a point of intervention. Stopping individuals as they're becoming politically active, religiously more observant, that's not a place where law enforcement and intelligence want to be.
You say that an entire community is vulnerable. These are community in the millions. And when you look all over the world, that's 1.3 billion people. When we look at 1.3 billion people as vulnerable and suspect, I mean, we're talking about clash of civilization. We're talking about not only civil liberties, we're talking about human rights being trampled all over in the West and throughout the world.
Right. Well, you're saying that they're suspect. I'm saying that they're vulnerable. Vulnerable means that they may.
But when you survey an entire community, that means they're suspect.
Well, I think that's one of the misunderstandings of what happened in New York, which is what I'm most familiar with. A community of
Brooklyn was surveyed.
600,000 people can't be surveilled by a group of 24 detectives. That's what we're talking about here. You can understand neighborhoods. You can understand incubators of radicalization, a particular cafe, a particular restaurant, particular barbershop, but you can't surveil a whole community, and that never happened here.
But this is exactly the problem then. On the one hand, you cannot survey an entire community. You're giving the impression that you're surveying an entire community in order to deter radicals from actually carrying any acts. And at the end of the day, an entire community lives in fear of being surveyed, of being watched over, of being seen as a fifth column. Primary job, your job and that of the state, is to protect people.
Yeah.
But if in the process, this is going to be a continuous blurring of the lines because you have to survey an entire community, then that's going to have to bring about a blowback from the community, increasing the threat, decreasing democracy.
Well, I think, the more the community understands what the thresholds are and that there are particular legal thresholds that are in place, and if those thresholds aren't met and no type of surveillance or investigation can occur, will help essentially improve relations with the community.
But we're not talking legal. I'm talking, let's assume for a second that I am very religious, I'm Salafist, and I'm very critical of American foreign policy in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and so on and so forth. That makes me a suspect, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't make you a suspect.
Being religious, fundamentalist, critical of American foreign policy doesn't make me a suspect?
No, that doesn't. But if you turn to do something and your actions, you start to meet with a group of people in private and talk about traveling overseas, you're talking about doing something, a conspiracy to do something in New York, in London, in Toronto, in Sydney, Australia, that's the point where law enforcement and intelligence...
Is that when entrapment comes in?
Well, entrapment shouldn't come in.
But it does. Most of the cases on this level were about people expressing their views, and then informers got involved, and some deals went in, and then those guys were shipped to prison.
Entrapment is all based on who's leading the group. Is the informant or the undercover leading the group, or are they there along for the ride, letting the conspirators lead? So from my experience in New York City, the informants and the undercovers never led the plot. They were along for the ride. They were monitoring what the group was so that law enforcement could intervene before they turned to violence.
Honestly, now, don't you think as long as this is going to continue to escalate, and now we have another war on terror against another so-called terrorist group over there, that the situation is going to remain fragile in the homeland front, and as long as there are trouble abroad, there's going to be trouble at home, and that will compromise democracy at home. Isn't that a real anxiety?
I think as long as there is violence in the Middle East and the United States is involved, that does serve as a grievance, a ready-made grievance, and the potential issue for radicalizing people in the West. Now, there are national security reasons for the United States to do what it's doing there, but we do have to understand that the threat will rise in the West, and in fact, the UK and Australia have raised their terrorist threats. Now, what its impact is going to be on democracy, I'm confident that it's not going to affect democracy.
So you don't think that terrorism and the war on terrorism already has its impact, negative impact on democracy in the United States?
I think it's had
with the introduction of the Patriot Act, the surveillance and all that, that doesn't matter for you?
From my experience, things were handled in a very legal way in New York City, and
it could be legal and undemocratic.
Well, legal is following the rules in a sense. The laws,
but laws can be undemocratic. Look at Russia.
Yeah, but the laws in place are things that have been voted on. So
you don't think they're compromising democracy?
I don't believe so. I think it pushes democracy to re-examine where the lines are, and I think that's a serious issue because there aren't easy questions. No one wants to be responsible for allowing people to carry out a terrorist act, but at the same time, no one wants to trample on civil liberties. And where do you find that place that's the balance between the two?
Thank you.
Thanks for the conversation.